Welcome to your new obsession, where every episode is packed with tools and science to help you become the best version of yourself. Whether you're a biohacking newbie or a seasoned pro, you're in the right place. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome back to the Biohacking Trainer Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Chapleski, longevity enthusiast, personal trainer, and fellow biohacker. Today, we're talking about one of the most popular and probably most misunderstood training concepts in longevity and the performance world. And that is Zone 2 training. You've probably heard people talk about it online. Everybody needs more Zone 2. Zone 2 is the secret to longevity. Everything from train at conversational pace, keep your heart rate between 120 to 140 beats per minute. But what exactly is Zone 2? How do you know if your heart rate's actually in Zone 2? Is the test truly accurate? Can your Apple Watch or Garmin actually tell you if you're in correct Zone 2? And is Zone 2 really the magic bullet for longevity? So today, we're spending the day breaking all of this down for you. So let's jump right into it. So let's talk about the basics first with Zone 2. So Zone 2 is generally considered a low to moderate intensity aerobic training zone. Essentially, you're working hard enough to create a meaningful physiological stimulus, but not so hard that you're accumulating large amounts of lactate and rapidly relying on anaerobic metabolism. So at this intensity, your body is primarily relying on aerobic metabolism to produce energy. That means your mitochondria are heavily involved in this process. So your cardiovascular system is working, your muscles are using oxygen efficiently, and over time, you're training your body to become better at producing energy aerobically. So one of the reasons Zone 2 has become so popular is because it sits in a really interesting place physiologically. So it's challenging enough to provide a stimulus, but easy enough that most people can't sustain it for a relatively long period of time. So that gives you the ability to accumulate a significant amount of aerobic training volume without creating the same level of fatigue as high intensity interval training. And that distinction is very important because improving your aerobic system isn't just about doing, say, the hardest workout possible. It's about consistently challenging the system in a way that you can recover from. So why exactly does Zone 2 truly matter? So let's talk a bit more about some of the adaptations that we truly care about. So one of the major goals of aerobic training is to improve your body's ability to take in, transport, and utilize oxygen. So that's going to include improvements from cardiac function, blood flow, capillary density, mitochondrial function, and even fat oxidation along with exercise efficiency. Your mitochondria are essentially the energy producing structures inside your cells, and the better your mitochondria become at producing energy aerobically, the better your body can support prolonged physical activity. So this is important for athletes, but it's also incredibly important for the general population. Because when we talk about longevity, we aren't just talking about how many years you live, we're also talking about how many of those years you can remain physically capable. Can you walk up, say, a flight of stairs without becoming excessively winded? Can you travel? Are you able to pick up your luggage and get it onto the conveyor belt or get it off of the conveyor belt? Can you hike? Can you play with your kids or your grandchildren? Are you able to pick your grandchildren up and hold them? Can you maintain independence as you age? Your aerobic capacity plays a very major role in all of these things. And that's the one reason cardiorespiratory fitness, particularly VO2 Max, is such an important marker of health performance, because Zone 2 is one tool that can help build the aerobic foundation that supports that capacity, but, and this is important, it's not the only tool. So this is where things become a little bit more complicated. A lot of people online will say Zone 2 is 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate, or Zone 2 is 180 minus your age, or even keep your heart rate between 120 and 140 beats per minute. The problem is that these formulas are essentially just estimates, or guesstimates in some cases. Estimates can be useful. However, they're not the same thing as measuring what's actually happening inside your body. So, two people who are the same age can have completely different maximum heart rates, resting heart rates, lactate thresholds, aerobic capacities, training histories, even metabolic responses to exercise. So, if two people are both 40 years old, their actual zone 2 heart rates can be meaningfully different. So, this is one of the reasons I always encourage people to think of heart rate zones as individualized rather than just universal. Similar to like when you would work out. One program will work for you, may not work for somebody else. One program might work for me, may not work for somebody else. So now how might you actually find your zone 2 now that you're thinking about this? There's a lot of different ways. The first method, you take your heart rate estimates. So the simplest approach is using a heart rate formula. One common method is to estimate maximum heart rate using 220 minus your age. So for example, if you're 40 years old, the estimated maximum heart rate would be 180 beats per minute. From there, you might calculate a percentage of that maximum heart rate to estimate your training zones. But again, the problem is that formula can be very inaccurate for a lot of different individuals. Some people may have a true maximum heart rate significantly higher or lower than the estimate. So this can be a starting point, but I wouldn't treat it as like the gospel. Now, another method is the talk test. It's a very simple method. In theory, it's a true low to moderate aerobic intensity. You should generally be able to speak in complete sentences to a friend, significant other. You should be breathing harder than you would at a rested state, but you should still feel relatively controlled. So if you're able to have a conversation, you're probably somewhere in the lower intensity aerobic range. If you're only able to get a few words out at a time and you're struggling to catch your breath, you're likely moving far beyond and you're starting to reach higher levels of intensity. So that talk test, it can be very useful because it's free, it's practical, and it's accessible for everybody, but it also does have its limitations. People have different perceptions of effort, same thing as different levels of pain tolerance, and two people may have very different physiological responses at the same perceived intensity or same perceived rate of exertion. So again, it's a helpful tool, but not a perfect measurement tool by any means. The third method that I always like to recommend is the lactate testing method. So it's another option. It's, like I said, looking at blood lactate. As exercise intensity increases, lactate production and clearance will change. So the goal is to identify important physiological thresholds. So doing this method can provide a more individualized understanding of how your body responds to different exercise intensities. However, blood lactate testing is not always convenient nor accessible, and it generally requires specialized equipment and some level of expertise to be able to interpret properly. The fourth method would be metabolic testing. So this is where it can be quite interesting. With a metabolic assessment, you can analyze the gases you breathe while you exercise. You can also measure oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production. From that information alone, you can gain insight into how your body is producing energy at different intensities. So instead of simply estimating your zones based on your age, you can actually observe how your body responds. This can be really helpful to identify important physiological thresholds and provide a much more training prescription. And this is especially valuable for people who are serious about optimizing their overall performance. Because instead of asking, what should my heart rate be based on a formula, you can begin asking, what is actually happening, say, inside my body at this intensity level. Now, wearables, that's always such a hot topic of conversation. This is a question that I get all the time personally. Say, can your Apple Watch determine your zone 2? Or your Garmin or your Whoop? Now, the short answer is they can be incredibly useful tools, but we all do need to understand what they're actually doing. Most wearables essentially are estimates. So they're estimating training zones using a combination of heart rate, user information, historical data, algorithms, estimated maximum heart rates, and sometimes even just performance data. So the problem is that your wearable is generally not directly measuring your oxygen consumption. So it is estimating your physiology. That doesn't make it useless. In fact, wearables can be incredibly valuable for monitoring trends. Like, for example, is your heart rate lower during a workout at the same pace? Are you able to run faster while maintaining the same heart rate? Is your recovery improving? Is your resting heart rate changing? And are your training loads becoming more manageable? Those trends can be extremely useful, but you should be cautious about treating a wearable zone 2 number as the absolute truth. A watch may tell you that your heart rate is 135 beats per minute, but that doesn't automatically tell you exactly what your muscles are doing metabolically. So this is where I like to think about wearables as excellent tools for tracking trends, but not always perfect tools for determining individualized physiology. And a big mistake that I do see people make when it comes to, say, zone 2 training is obsessing over one specific number. Some might say my zone 2 is 135 beats per minute. So if my heart rate goes up to 137 beats, I'm no longer training aerobically. I need to slow it down, and they're so fixated on trying to keep at that one specific number. That is not how physiology works. Your body is not a light switch. You don't suddenly transition from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism just because your heart rate increases by 2 beats per minute. Essentially, from a physiological transition, it's going to occur along a continuum. This is why I think it's much more useful to think about intensity zones as ranges rather than a very rigid boundary. The goal is essentially not to spend 45 minutes staring at your watch and panicking every time your heart rate changes, whether it's too high or too low, by a beat or so. The goal is to essentially create a repeatable physiological stimulus. Another interesting question I do get a lot is in regards to how much zone 2 training should somebody be doing. And essentially, in short, it depends, and it depends on the individual. So your training age depends on your goals, what's your schedule, your recovery capacity, even your current fitness level. For many people, 2 to 4 sessions per week can be a very reasonable starting point. A session can last anywhere from about 30 to 60 minutes, and some people may benefit from more, some people may benefit from less. Just depends, again, on that person's needs. For someone who's currently sedentary, even 20 minutes to a maximum of 30 minutes of consistent aerobic exercise can be extremely valuable. The key is always just the progression. So you don't necessarily need to jump into 5 hours of zone training per week if you're just trying to get off of being sedentary or get off the couch. You're going to end up overdoing it, overreaching, and hurting yourself. You might want to start with just doing 2 30-minute sessions. Build that up for a couple of weeks. As you get closer to like the 3 or 4 week mark, then add a third day. As always, just slowly start to gradually increase the duration. The goal is essentially to always build that consistency, because the most effective training programs typically are the ones that you can actually sustain and keep up with. So when it comes to zone 2 and making sure we're in zone 2 training, or what's the type of equipment that will be great to work for and utilize when you're training for zone 2, there's several different ones. You can perform zone 2 training methods on, say, a treadmill. You can do it on a bike. You can do it on a rowing machine, an elliptical. You can do this while doing an inclined walk, an outdoor run, or hiking. For someone with joint limitations, I would tend to say go towards more like cycling or even an elliptical. Potentially can be more comfortable. Someone who enjoys to run, definitely easy running would be a good option. Someone that's a bit newer to exercise, incline walking is a great option and an excellent starting point. The modality matters less than your ability to consistently achieve the desired physiological intensity. The modality is just more so a preference of what you prefer and what makes it a bit more sustainable and tolerable for you to go and do the zone 2 training per week. Now, can somebody build VO2 Max with, say, zone 2 training? Absolutely. However, the disclaimer is this requires some nuance. So zone 2 can improve the aerobic foundation that supports your overall cardiorespiratory fitness. However, if your goal is specifically to maximize your VO2 Max, high intensity training is also extremely valuable. This is where many people make the mistake of believing that one training zone is superior to all others. It isn't. A well-rounded program typically includes different intensities. So you might have, like, say, a lower intensity aerobic training, a moderate intensity work, You may do threshold training, you may do high intensity intervals, you may do strength training or recovery days. The aerobic base helps you essentially perform more work aerobically. High intensity training challenges your ability to work near your maximal capacities. Strength training is going to improve more force production and muscle function. And recovery allows you to adapt to all of it. And the question isn't, should I do zone 2 for intervals? The better question is, how can I intelligently use different training intensities to accomplish what my goals are? Now, another interesting talking point when it comes to zone 2 is zone 2 in longevity or zone 2 training for longevity. I would say this is where zone 2 recently receives the most attention. And I think some of that attention is certainly justified. Maintaining aerobic capacity as we age is incredibly important, but I also think the longevity conversation can be certainly oversimplified. Zone 2 is not a magic anti-aging pill by any means. It doesn't replace strength training, it doesn't replace high intensity exercises, and it certainly does not replace sleep, nutrition, or managing your stress levels. Longevity is truly multifactorial. But aerobic fitness is absolutely an important piece to the puzzle. So you need all of these different coalitions combined into one. The ability to essentially efficiently produce energy, transport oxygen, tolerate physical stress, and recover from activity can all contribute to maintaining that physical function throughout your life. And one of the great things about Zone 2 is that it gives people a sustainable way to accumulate aerobic exercise. Now, in regards to putting this into practice, what does a simple Zone 2 workout look like? Here's one simple example I can give to each and every one of you. Start with a 5 to 10 minute warm-up. Gradually increase your intensity until your breathing becomes noticeably elevated. You should be able to speak in complete sentences, although you may not feel like having a long conversation. Completely normal. Then maintain that intensity for approximately 30 to 45 minutes. I always recommend this with a partner, say a significant other or a friend. Just makes that a bit easier. Or if you don't have somebody with you, have somebody that you can call on the phone. Things you're going to want to monitor during this process is your heart rate, your breathing, your RPE. Basically, it's just your rate of perceived exertion, how hard you feel it is on a scale of 1 to 10, and how your body's feeling if you're having aches, pains, or anything out of the ordinary. Finish with a gradual cool down. So if you're using a wearable, use it as a guide. Great for tracking trends, but not the end all be all. And if your heart rate gradually increases over the course of the workout, despite maintaining the same pace, that may be a good sign of cardiac drift or increasing physiological strain. That information can be extremely useful. Over time, you can begin to see whether you're able to perform more work at the same heart rate. For example, maybe today you can walk at 3.5 miles per hour at a certain heart rate, and several months from now, you may be able to walk at 4 miles per hour at that same heart rate. Now, the biggest takeaway I want each and every one of you to have from this podcast today is Zone 2 training is not about chasing a perfect number. It's about developing essentially your aerobic system through consistent, sustainable training. So use heart rate, use the talk test, use perceived exertion, use your wearable data, and when appropriate, consider more advanced tools like lactate testing, or metabolic assessments. But don't become so obsessed with precision that you lose sight of the bigger picture here. The goal is to consistently, which is the biggest key, consistently challenge your aerobic system. And over time, that can help improve your ability to perform work, recover from exercise, and maintain your physical capacity. And when it comes to longevity, maintaining the ability to move, exercise, and recover throughout your lifespan is one of the most valuable investments that you can truly make. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the Biohacking Trainer podcast and follow along for more conversations about performance, recovery, exercise science, and longevity on our Instagram page. And if you're interested in understanding your own physiology on a deeper level, make sure to check out our episode on VO2 Max and metabolic testing. And in future episodes, we're going to take an even deeper dive into how to actually identify your zone 2 using heart rate, breathing, perceived exertion, and metabolic testing. because the more accurately you can understand how your body responds to exercise, more intelligently you can train. And as always, thanks again for tuning into the Biohacking Trainer podcast. Until next time, stay healthy, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one.